Hello and welcome back. I'm Karen Sullivan of Soul Symbols, and this is our Friday Contemplation. On Mondays, I look at the wider sky, the broad view and the larger pattern, and that archetypal web moving through our collective field. And on Fridays, I come down to the ground, into our lived reality and that felt texture of a pattern. So we will be moving on Fridays into deeper explorations of not only what it means in the sky, but in our bodies, choices, relationships, and in the deeper architecture of life. So get your headphones, put your feet up and enjoy this reflection with me. This week, I want to sit with Chiron, and I want to sit with him in a slightly deeper way than the phrase we so often hear, which is Chiron as the wounded healer. And that phrase is really useful. It's opening a door. It's introducing the archetypal landscape. But sometimes I think it can become too tidy, too easy, almost too beautiful. We hear wounded healer and we can very quickly turn that into a comforting idea that our wounds automatically become wisdom, or that suffering naturally becomes medicine. Or that once we've passed through pain, we're somehow healed enough to guide others through theirs. And yeah, there can be truth in that. Many of us do become more compassionate through the places where life has broken us open. Many of us learn through pain and develop a kind of tenderness, attention, patience, or recognition because we know what it is to suffer. But Chiron's story is so much more complex than that. And that's what I want to look at today and contemplate on. I've been sat with it all week. And the reason I've been sitting with that is because as we move through early June, Chiron is sitting at the very end of Aries, preparing to move into Taurus. Symbolically, that feels powerful to me. It's the anaretic degree of the first sign of the zodiac, and Chiron's been traveling through Aries fire for years now. So Aries is that first spark of life, that cry of I am, the sign of survival, courage, of anger and instinct. It's about our assertion, defense, and our right to exist. Now Chiron is approaching Taurus, that fertile valley, our bodies, the earth. It's the soil, the plant, but it's also the medicine. That wound is beginning to move from fire into earth, from reaction into embodiment. So we're moving from the burning place into the place where something has to be carried and digested. It's where we need to live with and perhaps over time get transformed by it. And that brings me to the word I've been turning over this week, which is the Greek word pharmakon. Pharmakon's really fascinating work because it carries this ambiguity. It can mean medicine, so remedy, the drug, but also it can mean poison. It can mean harm or potion, so it doesn't separate healing and harm into neat little boxes. It suggests the same substance can cure or kill. That same plant might soothe or it might poison, and the same medicine can save, numb, distort, intoxicate, or initiate. And that depends on the dose and whose body it's going into. It depends also on the timing, on the relationship, and on what the thing is being used for. And when I think of Chiron, this feels completely central to him. Because Chiron is an embodied healer. He's connected with plant medicine, with the natural world, with the knowledge of the body and the arts of healing, music, philosophy, hunting, teaching and guiding. He's the civilized centaur, the wise one, the teacher of heroes. He carries this extraordinary refinement of instinct into wisdom. He's part animal, part divine teacher, part wounded creature, and he's part physician. And his own story begins in a womb. Chiron is born through violent shame and rejection. Kronos, in horse form, pursues Philyra, who's turned herself into a mare to escape him. From that violation, Chiron's conceived, and when he's born, his form is unbearable to his mother. He's part horse and part human. And so Chiron's unwanted, rejected, cast away. He's abandoned. So before the famous poisoned arrow, before he becomes the healer who cannot heal himself, there's already a wound of origin. He's carrying a wound of being unwanted, of being born from something shameful. There is the wound of the body itself being experienced as unacceptable. And there's a wound of parental rejection. And I wonder about that. I wonder whether Chiron's pursuit of knowledge, his mastery of healing, wisdom, usefulness, and his teaching of the great Greek heroes, all of that beautiful refinement may also have been his antidote. Because sometimes what saves us also hides us. Sometimes the thing that becomes our gift began as a way of surviving an unbearable wound. So the abandoned child becomes useful, and those who are rejected become wise. That sense of being unwanted is where the child makes themselves necessary. So that person who's cast out becomes the ones others seek for guidance. And particularly the person whose body was a source of shame becomes the one who learns the secrets of the bodies, the plants, the remedies, and the arts. And again, we're with the Pharmakon. Knowledge can be medicine, and so can service. Being needed can feel like medicine. And definitely becoming skilled, wise, helpful, capable, insightful, spiritually useful, all of this can become a real and meaningful remedy. And yet, if underneath it sits the old wound of abandonment, it can also carry poison. There's that sense of, if I must be useful in order to be loved, there's a poison there. And the same with a sense of needing or having to heal others in order to avoid the place in us that feels unhealable. There again is poison. And if I must become wise, good, spiritual, needed, generous, or endlessly available because some part of me still feels unwanted, there's poison there too. This is why Chiron's story is so powerful. He's not a shallow archetype. He doesn't give us an easy redemption arc. He gives us the complexity of healing itself. Later in the myth, Chiron is wounded by a poisoned arrow, and the arrow is connected with Hercules, someone within that heroic world that Chiron has taught, served, guided, loved. This is so important because the wound comes through the very field of his devotion, through the heroic masculine and the world of strength, skill, training, courage and battle, through the world that Chiron helped shape. And the poison is no ordinary poison. It's the Hydra's venom. So it's a poison so terrible that Chiron, the great healer, can't cure it. And this is the peak of the story for me, that the healer can't heal himself. The one who knows the medicine meets the poison that no remedy can answer. And the person who spent his life becoming wise meets the limits of his wisdom. Chiron, who taught heroes, meets the suffering that heroism can't overcome. And this is where I think we have to be careful with the way we speak about healing. In our modern Western mindset, we often carry a very particular idea of healing. We can think of it as becoming whole in the sense of becoming free of the wound. We can imagine that if we do enough work, enough therapy, spiritual practice, reflection, enough shadow work, enough nervous system regulation, if we practice forgiven and inner child work, enough understanding, eventually we think the wound would disappear. Sometimes wounds soften and the patterns loosen. Sometimes our body releases what is held for years, and we're no longer ruled by an old story in the same way. But there are also wounds that leave scars and create limits. There are experiences that change the body, the psyche, the nervous system, the capacity for trust, the shape of life. There are losses that will never be replaced and betrayals that will never be made innocent. There are childhood wounds that may be understood, grieved, integrated, and held with more compassion, yet they still remain part of the fabric of the person. And I got to thinking, perhaps this is where Chiron brings us into a more embodied understanding of wholeness. Because that wholeness, it's not the fantasy of being untouched. Wholeness is the capacity to include the truth of what has marked us. It's the ability to be able to say, this happened and this shaped me. This changed me. It gave me gifts, but it also gave me limitations. This made me tender in some places and guarded in other, and this made me wise in all sorts of ways and reactive in others. This is part of my humanity. So we can look back again at the wound as Pharmakon. The wound can become poison, and we know this. A wound can poison the way we love, how we choose. It can poison the way we see ourselves and the way we interpret silence, distance, conflict, intimacy, desire, rejection, closeness. The abandoned child can grow up and find themselves drawn again and again to emotionally unavailable partners. Or that neglected child can seek love from people who just can't give it. So someone who was unseen may keep finding relationships where they have to perform, prove, plead, rescue, explain, or earn their place. And from the outside, people can ask, why do you keep choosing the same wound? But inside the psyche, there's often a strange intelligence at work. Some part of the soul may be returning to the original site of pain to try and complete something unfinished, trying to make the unavailable one available, or the abandoning one stay, trying to make the cold person warm, trying to make the withholding one finally choose us. It's almost as if our psyches say, if I can solve it here, perhaps I can solve it there. If this person loves me, then perhaps my original wound will close. If this time the story ends differently, perhaps the old pain will finally be undone. But the repetition itself can become poisonous. The return to the wound can deepen the wound. The attempt to complete the unfinished sequence can leave us trapped inside it. And again, Chiron speaks, because Chiron can't cure the wound by applying more medicine, and he can't out-know it, out-serve it, out-teach it. He can't become so useful that that poison disappears. Chiron has to meet the terrible limit and surrender to the reality of the wound. And surrender is a word we have to handle carefully because it can sound so passive. It can also sound like giving up or defeat. But in this Chiron story, surrender feels like something more sacred and more difficult. It's the surrender of the fantasy that he should be able to cure everything, the surrender of healer's pride, of the saviour identity, of the belief that knowledge can master every suffering. It's a surrender of the argument with reality. And this is where the shadow of the wounded healer archetype matters, because the wounded healer has two shadows. It has the shadow of victimhood and of saviourhood. So in victimhood, the wound becomes the whole identity. Everything circles back to the injury. The person may have been genuinely harmed, and the wound is real, unjust, devastating, and life-altering. And still the psyche can begin to build a house inside of that wound. The wound becomes the explanation for everything, the defense against everything. It becomes the proof and the authority, the place where life is repeatedly interpreted through pain. And in saviourhood, the wound is escaped through rescuing. The person becomes the healer, helper, guide, teacher, the fixer and the rescuer. Again, there may be genuine goodness there, real care, wisdom and great capacity. But saviourhood can become a flight from the original wound. It can feel like if we're saving someone else, we don't have to feel the place in us that can't be saved. If I'm needed by you, then I don't have to feel the old terror of being unwanted. And if I can heal you, perhaps I can avoid the grief of what in me remains unhealed. Victimhood and saviourhood seem very different on the surface, but both can avoid the full confrontation with the wound. Both can avoid the humility of embodiment. And they can avoid the moment where we say, this has marked me and given me limits, and I have to learn how to live truthfully with those limits. And this is where the line often attributed to Rumi comes in. The wound is the place where the light enters. And even though I love that line, when I think with Chiron, we have to let it become more complex. That wound is where the light enters in, yeah, but the light doesn't always enter as comfort. Sometimes it enters as truth. It shows us the wound we've been circling for years and reveals the patterns we keep calling fate. Sometimes that light shows us that our medicine has become poison and that our service has become avoidance. Sometimes that light shows us that our victimhood has become a kind of identity, or that our healing role has become a way of refusing to be human. Sometimes the light enters through the wound by revealing to us that the wound cannot be removed. That is painful, and it's honest. There are wounds that ask to be treated, to be grieved. There are wounds that ask for justice and boundaries. There are wounds that ask for therapy, body work, rest, protection, ritual, witness, time, community, medicine. And there are wounds that ask us to stop insisting they need to disappear before we're allowed to belong to life. And that for me is where Chiron begins to move towards Taurus. Taurus is the earth, the body, the field. It's what remains after the fire of Aries. And Taurus is the valley that receives the ash, bone, the scar, the seed, the poison, and the medicine. And as Chiron approaches Taurus, I feel there's an invitation to bring the wound down into the body without constantly trying to make a story out of it, justify it, solve it, spiritualize it, or perform healing around it. It's asking us, what does this wound feel like in the body? Has it hardened me? Has it made me overextend? Where has it made me hungry and made me unable to receive? Where has it made me frightened of rest, pleasure, stability, touch, nourishment, peace? Because Taurus asks us very simple questions in the end. Can you eat, rest, receive? Can you feel the ground and inhabit the body you have with its history, its limits, its scars, its beauty, its fatigue, its instincts and its needs? And that really moves me. And there's something very moving to me about Chiron, the plant-wise healer, entering Taurus, a sign of the fertile valley. The plant, the Pharmakon, is poison and remedy, and the wound can be poison and teacher. The earth can grow both the nettle and rose, belladonna and chamomile, hemlock and mint. The task is discernment, and that is part of mature healing. To know what's medicine for us now and what's become poison. To know when our service is generous, but also where it's escape. It's also about knowing when telling the story is healing and when that story keeps our wound open. It's an understanding of when we are ready to pass something on and when we're still trying to be seen as wise because the child in us still feels unwanted. And part of this myth of Chiron is Prometheus. Prometheus gives fire to humanity and is punished for it. He's bound and each day his liver is torn out, only for it to regenerate and be torn out again. That is such a visceral image, daily suffering, repeated torment. The liver, the organ of processing heat, bile, regeneration and purification. And Chiron, unable to heal his own wound, eventually gives up his immortality. He exchanges it, and through that exchange, Prometheus is released. That is extraordinary, because Chiron's final medicine is not a cure he applies to himself. His final medicine is surrender. He releases his immortality and the endlessness of suffering. He releases the identity that has kept him suspended between divine endurance and unbearable pain. And in that surrender, another being is being freed. This is where Chiron's wisdom becomes an offering. It's passed through him, through that abandonment and shame. It's also passed through knowledge and service, through poison and the failure of remedy, through the collapse of the identity as healer, through the surrender of what he couldn't carry anymore. And only then does it become something larger than himself. I think this is the deepest teaching of Chiron. Our wounds don't automatically make us wise, just as our healing gifts don't indicate that we've met our own pain. And our suffering justice doesn't give us instant authority. But when a wound has truly passed through us, when we've let it show us where we're human, limited, scarred, humbled, and yet still capable of love, then something changes. That wisdom becomes quieter. It stops needing to prove itself. That wisdom doesn't need to rescue everyone and make a shrine out of pain. It becomes embodied, grounded. It becomes something like medicine. And maybe that's the fertile valley Chiron is approaching, a place where the wound is carried differently and the scar is honoured without being worshipped, a place where the body is no longer treated as the enemy of the spirit. Maybe this fertile valley is where the unhealed parts of us are no longer exiled from our idea of wholeness. I think this is a place where the Pharmakon is understood with humility, because what once saved us may one day need to be laid down. So this week, as Chiron stands at the edge of Aries, preparing to enter Taurus, perhaps we can ask gently where the fire has brought us and what wound has been burning in the place of I am. We can look at old shame, anger, rejection, abandonment, or survival story that's been asking for our attention, and where we've tried to cure it by becoming useful, needed, or wise, strong, spiritual, capable, untouchable. We can look at where we've returned to the same wound, hoping for a different ending, and where might the earth now be asking us to stop fighting the wound long enough to feel in our bodies what is true. There will probably be grief in that, but also relief. There may be humility of recognizing that some things just can't be undone. We may find a deeper mercy because wholeness doesn't require us to become untouched. Wholeness asks us to become truthful, to include the scar and honor our limits, to recognize the poison and receive the medicine, to stop making the wound our entire identity, or to stop using our healing gifts to escape the places where we are still human. The wound may be where the light enters, and perhaps the light enters most deeply when we stop demanding that it erase the wound and allow it instead to reveal the life still present around it. The valley is still fertile, and we are in our bodies, and the earth receives us. And somewhere in the strange mystery of the Pharmakon, what has passed through us may one day become wisdom we can offer with humility, tenderness, and truth. If this reflection speaks to something moving in your own life, you might want to sit with it slowly this week, perhaps with a journal, a candle, or simply with a hand on your body, and the question, what am I still trying to heal by rejecting it? And that is what I have for you. Thank you for being here. And I'll be back on Monday with the broader picture of the sky. And until then, I invite you to be tender with yourselves. Be honest with what is surfacing and listen carefully for what is alive at depth. Have a restful weekend, and I will see you on the next one.